Beckett Seneca going third was not the biggest surprise for me. The biggest surprise for me was that Zeev Buium went 12th, that he was the 6th of the top 6 defensemen taken, and that the Philadelphia Flyers actually traded out of that spot. And the thing is, we'll get to Philly in a second, because I think that that's a different topic. It's different than some of the other teams that drafted defensemen. I had Zeev Buium as the third defenseman on my list, behind Levshinov and Salayev. And Salayev is a 6'7" mobile defenseman. There just aren't very many guys like him that exist. Zeev Buium is a player that I think has a lot of potential. Like, we could look back on this draft and we could say that guy ended up being the best defenseman in the draft. I mean, it's very possible given his track record and what he showed. But, there are a couple of things that happened. And I have a piece on FloHockey.tv where I kind of reverse engineered the first round to explain why I think Zeev Buium fell the way that he did. And one of the reasons, and I want to put this to you as well, one of the reasons is that there were not one, but 2 smaller market Canadian teams. And when I say smaller market, I mean not Montreal, not Toronto, and not Vancouver. I think those 3 cities are still going to be fine and can get whoever they want. The other teams, I really do feel, are going to shy away from American players, and not just American college players, American players. We have seen this, Calgary, Ottawa selected Carter Yakimchuk, big right shot defenseman. Calgary selected Zane Parekh, 96 points in the OHL this year, right shot defenseman, highly offensive defenseman. Both of those players, to me, are decisively behind Zeev Buium in terms of that. That may not be true for their scouting staffs, but what did you make of that? And am I on the right track here with this small? Some of these smaller market teams just simply aren't going to pick Canadians or Americans.
Yeah, I thought that piece was awesome. By the way, I read that.
Thank you.
When you tweeted it out, it was just a really cool way to unpack, hey, how this board fell, because everyone's board is so different, despite a lot of consensus in the public markets, right? In the public draft board, a lot of them look the same and feel the same. But when you talk to, the people we talk to around the draft, you get a sense for, hey, if this guy's available for Seattle, for example, the draft's going to get turned upside down because no one thinks they have this guy here. So anyway, I was surprised that it took that long for the D to start going. I think there was a lot of consensus early that there was a bunch of public boards that had a run on D, kind of maybe at 2 to 5. We're going to be all defensemen, right? You just never know. I love watching Zeev Buium. He got to play his draft year, which I think is an advantage in college. So he put up, 50 points as a true freshman coming out of the development team. He missed last year's draft by a couple months. Fabulous player. No more ink needs to be spilled on what he brings to the table. You touched on it earlier, small market Canadian teams. I can say with almost 100% certainty that's why Calgary made the selection they made in Zane Parekh, not to discount what he's capable of at all. I heard someone on the draft coverage call him an offenseman. He just takes it and goes. He's a really talented player, but he's truly one-dimensional. But there were some cool pieces about him. He's like, hey, I know that the way I play is different, and I'm going to try and make it work in the NHL. Calgary's been burned by Adam Fox, by Matthew Tkachuk, and others, where they just don't.
Johnny Gaudreau, Noah Hannafin,
left them kind of at the altar. And so if I'm Craig Conroy sitting there, kind of Calgary's in a weird place. They've got some older guys with unmovable deals and a pretty good young pool of players. They just traded Mangiapane, who scored a ton for them. Hey, I'm going to take the guy that I know that's going to come here and not going to screw around. And not to say that Zeev was going to do that or his camp was signaling that before the draft, but it's a risk you have to consider. And, they still took a good player, but I'm a big fan of Zeev, and, friend of the program, Judd Brackett, puts his hand on the table to, make a trade. They traded a third-round pick. The price to move up one spot was a third-round pick, to go and get a player that he thought was, a game changer. And, the steal of the first round, if it's hard to call the 12th overall pick in the draft a steal, but they got a pretty good one. And I'll be interested to see if he goes back to college. His brother signed, after they won the national championship. I don't know what else he has left to accomplish. Minnesota could desperately use a player like him. They don't have that QB1, back there running a power play, and that team's got to get going. And he could be, kind of instant offense right out of the gate. I thought it was an awesome pick. Good for them.
Yeah, I thought it was a great pick too, and I think there is going to be some significant debate on what the best path forward is for Zeev Buium. I think that there's no harm in going back, but I also think that there is some motivation. I think coming out of the combine, a lot of teams said, "Hey, there's a chance that he's going to be ready to come out," and so I think there are going to be some nervous moments for the University of Denver because he is. He's a very critical player. It's also going to be some nervous moments for Team USA because they would have their number one defenseman and a critical piece of their repeat bid. They have a lot of returning players. Their camp is coming up in a couple of weeks, and Buium is on the list. And we'll see if ultimately he ends up being there.
This is the last year on Minnesota's cap where they have to eat the huge charge for Parise and Suter, right? And so it becomes, I think it reduces by $7 million each next year. So they've got a lot more flexibility. So is it worth plugging him in now? Burn a year, who cares? He fits. He's probably better plug and play, I think, than you're going to get on the open market if they're ready to turn him pro. Right? They're going to be up it all year. Why not just get him ingratiated in there so they can start building around him going forward?
Yeah, and I think the other thing that's true of this whole situation with Minnesota is that they have some D prospects that just haven't taken the step necessary to be NHL ready. And so, Carson Lambos isn't going to be coming in next year, unless, barring some insane summer that he had, so there's really, that there is an opening, there's an opportunity. And I think all those are good points. So we'll see where that all ends up. I did want to talk a little bit about Philadelphia because you're Philadelphia based. You've seen the reaction to Philadelphia Flyers fans. Now, there's one important thing to bring up, and I know this is going to be part of your conversation about this, but so they have Jamie Drysdale, they have Cam York, and they have Emil Andrea, who was the other one that they brought up. No disrespect to Emil Andrea. He's not in the same stratosphere as either of those other players. I like the player. I think he's a good prospect. He's not in the same category as those guys. But, the other thing is if you they get a third round pick out of the deal, which I think is, nice to get an extra asset if you're not going to pick the player. And I was like, was that just because they didn't want the optics of passing on a top tier defenseman to take a second tier center? And I love Jet Luchanko. I wrote this in the piece. I think he's an outstanding prospect. He's a very good stylistic fit for Philadelphia. But if we're looking at the tiers of the drafts, right, and consensus versus the public, and I think this will be part of your conversation as well. The tiers between, I think Luchanko was in at least a tier below where I thought Buium was relative to this draft class. So, what are your thoughts from the Philadelphia move on the Buium situation there?
Yeah, like you said, I live here, have a bunch of friends on the team, root for them and their success. So you want to see them do well. You're invested in what they're doing there. Danny does a great job and has done a great job. They walked into a pretty tough situation. They're corporate owned, so they don't necessarily have an identity, one guy walking in there saying, we're going to get this right. And I think you've seen in the last handful of Stanley Cup winning teams how important an awesome owner is, right? An empowering owner to get out there and just go make shit happen, right? If you believe, I will believe in you. And these guys are owned by a cable company. Right. And so it's been a long time since, Mr. Snyder passed away. And so they've come in there with a job to do, and Keith Jones and him and Torts have done it, pretty well thus far. And you kind of said it there, hey, they've said, Danny said it. We have Cam York, who we're really high on, who quietly had a really, really good season after being called out by Torts, early on. I don't know if you're an NHL player, and he kind of clapped back, with his performance over the course of the year. Jamie Drysdale came in, was great, got hurt. He had surgery. He'll be ready to go. Emil Andrea, like you said, is a ways away. They also got Oliver Bonk last year in the end of the first round, who scored almost 70 points for London and was critical in their OHL championship, team this season. So they have that category checked, right? And I think that this rolls into the debate best player available versus team and prospect pool construction. And it was funny to watch and continue to watch. Philly's got a very passionate, fan base here. 0.00% of them watch hockey, and 100.0% of them think they know everything about it. And so, they watch them pass to take a center who no one's ever heard of down here before. They couldn't pick him out of a lineup if it was in their living room, and it was meltdown. Not only did we traded away one spot to get this guy, blah, 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 chaos. Fire Danny Briere. It's the same old stuff. No one knows what they're doing, right? They actually traded that third round pick away already. I forget what they did with it at the draft, but they moved it. And he's been very publicly facing, saying, look, we think the 25 draft is better and deeper, and they have 6 picks in the first 2 rounds. They have three firsts and 3 seconds, right? And now we just talked about how much we both like Zeev Buium and how good of an NHL player we think he could be. And so, that presses the bet on their pick even more, just because he's always going to be held and compared against Zeev, even though they play different positions and have a different approach, to the game. Jet Luchanko was almost not eligible for this draft by like 3 weeks, I think. He's super young. I think he's like the late August
young
birthday, right? And he brings an element to Philly that they lack. He can really scoot. And Philly is one of the slower teams in the NHL, and you saw that kind of down the stretch. They had almost a historic collapse to miss the playoffs on the last day after being almost a 95%, lock to make it, I think, starting in early March or late February. So you're adding a right shot center who can really push the pace on a team that's trying to get younger and faster. And that's Danny and Brent Flair's call to do that, right? Zeev Buium may be great in 4 or 5 years. He may be great next year. But it really sent the fan base here into a tizzy. I mean, it was a spiral, and it's funny to watch. And, they're passionate and they care, but this poor kid coming in here to development camp has no chance just because of who he's not, right?
Yeah.
And they read all the websites and they read all the models, and everyone glows about Zeev because he played the World Junior and blah, blah, blah. I mean, Jet Luchanko could make Team Canada in the World Junior next year and light it up, and everyone's building a statue for Danny outside the arena already. Right.
It's possible, though. Yeah. And I say again, like, none of this is to slight Jet Luchanko. He was 18th on my list, and after the combine, there was a ton of buzz. And I'm telling you right now, a lot of teams had Luchanko higher than 18th on their board. I think he would
from the combine were outstanding. Someone tweeted out his performance of all the off-ice stuff, which most people don't get to kind of dig into. And he was first or second in a bunch of notable categories, and everything else that he wasn't, he was like top 6 or 7. So just
lower body. Lower body. He was outstanding. Like his vertical jumps were towards the top. Like I think he was second to EJ Emery, who's 6'4" and played football growing up. So like he's really like there's a lot of really impressive things with Luchanko, and I think there's also a good point there is like the consensus best player available. And I talked about this on last week's podcast. The consensus best player available is not how teams are building their list. They are building teams. They're building teams, and that is they need to find whoever fits into their dynamic. And the thing that I'll say though is I like Cam York a lot. I like Jamie Drysdale a lot. I even like Emil Andre a lot. I do think that Zeev Buium of that quartet of players, based on projection, and this is all projection, right? Based on projection, I think he's going to be the best of that group. And so you say,
and I think it comes down to belief of, hey, is what makes this guy special amongst his draft class peers portable to the NHL for a guy who's subsize, quote unquote, relative to what it takes to win. I think there's been a lot of analytics done, and I heard about it on other podcasts. I haven't had a chance to double click into it as much as I would like to. A number one defenseman under 6'2" with a bunch of other mechanics behind it has like a minimal chance of leading a team through the playoffs to win a Stanley Cup.
Yeah.
Right. And if I forget all the ins and outs of it, and I'll get butchered for that, and I'll find it. But it was, hey, it came up in the context of Vancouver and Quinn Hughes, who just won the Norris Trophy, right? But is that the kind of guy at his size and ability that's going to get you through 4 rounds of playoffs as a number one and win the Stanley Cup? You need that big, mean, kind of pound it guy. And Zeev is not that, and that's okay. But again, you could have just passed on the most impactful player of the bunch, for a young center who might be viewed as a reach. So,
yeah. Yep, and I'll say, the Matvei Michkov pick is going to be the defining pick of Danny Briere's GM tenure, but this one is going to be monitored for the rest of time. So enjoy that. It should be fun.